What does it mean to receive a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, otherwise known as C-PTSD? What does it mean to not receive a diagnosis? I want to talk a little bit about that today, as well as kind of the idea generally of a mental health diagnosis, but in particular, the symptomology associated with C-PTSD. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. So if you have been consuming any sort of mental health content, you certainly have heard of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm really glad that people are talking about this. It's not technically something that you can, it's not a formal diagnosis, but it is something that a lot of people are being diagnosed with and even self-diagnosing. And there's a lot of benefit in having a diagnosis. One of the biggest is that it helps reduce the amount of shame that we feel about the struggles that we have. It can also help us kind of conceptualize things a little bit better to kind of know what path to take. So there certainly are some pros in that. But part of the reason I'm doing this video today is because I've heard some different people talk about a diagnosis of C-PTSD. And while they don't always necessarily talk about it from a place of concern, what I'm taking from what they're saying is a little concerning to me. Because what I'm hearing in much of what people are saying is that, well, this is just who I am. This is just something that I will live with. And I just have to learn how to kind of manage these really sometimes pretty horrific sorts of symptoms. And that's concerning to me because it creates a sense of powerlessness for people to think that, well, it makes sense because I experienced this trauma and these are my symptoms, so of course it fits, and therefore this is just my life. And that concerns me in addition to the powerlessness, because what is that doing to people who have thought about healing or who may think about healing in the future and have this understanding of it that will tell them that there's really nothing you can do. You're still going to struggle. You're going to struggle with relationships. You're going to struggle with attachment. You're going to struggle with depression and anxiety. You're going to struggle with these things because you have complex PTSD. And that's just the way it is. And that concerns me, as I said, but it also saddens me really quite significantly, because while I am in complete agreement with the idea of complex PTSD, I remember years ago when they were first talking about trying to get it into the DSM, somebody that I used to kind of follow a little bit. This was kind of before social media was really big, but he's written a lot and done research around basically complex PTSD. He was one of the people trying to get it in the DSM. But the thing about it is that while there is certainly a difference between general PTSD, and that can encompass a lot of different things, a lot of different types of trauma. Complex PTSD is where it's not a single trauma. That's one of the biggest things, but also a variety of factors that go into it that create that complexity. And if you have seen very many of my videos, you have heard me talk about things being complex, complicated, and certainly multi-layered. And the multi-layered, because I've talked about like who the perpetrator is, how many perpetrators you've had, what kind of support did you have, what have you believed about who, like there's so many different layers, right? That is part of that complexity, that is the complex aspect. And it goes on for an extended period of time, much of the time. So the symptomology, the differentiation between PTSD and C-PTSD, they're very real, and they are important as individuals for us to be able to recognize and understand that. And it's incredibly important for practitioners, for people in the field of both mental health and in the medical field, to really understand those differences. I think it's actually good for anybody in a professional field to understand those differences. But we do need to kind of understand those differences. But it's so incredibly important to recognize that a diagnosis, really any sort of mental health diagnosis, with the exception of schizophrenia and somebody that truly does have bipolar disorder, and to a degree, people on the neurodivergent spectrum as well, to a degree. It's important to recognize that while you may fit into this diagnosis, whether somebody else is diagnosing you or you are self-diagnosing, that this may be a very accurate way to conceptualize the struggles and symptoms that you have. It doesn't have to be that it is what the rest of your life needs to look like, or how you need to experience the rest of your life. And that is incredibly important to understand. It is important to recognize that it makes sense that this is where you are. That's so incredibly important. It's also important to recognize that while we can conceptualize this and make sense of it and understand it and even give us, in a sense, like this blueprint to move forward, unfortunately, there isn't like a real great blueprint out there, because there are so many people who think it's just about then managing symptoms. But we need to understand that this diagnosis, whatever it might be anxiety disorder, it might be depression, whatever it is, that this diagnosis gives us a starting point. Okay, now I know where to start. And then we can have this blueprint, and really this entire channel is about the blueprint. Then, okay, if this is the struggle, then this is the blueprint that goes with it. And then this is how I move forward. And I have experienced it myself personally, but in my work, there are countless numbers of people that I've worked with over the years who, some came to me with a diagnosis, some were diagnosed after beginning to see me because maybe I sent them to a psychiatrist or something like that. But while working with me, they didn't have to stop seeing me to see the psychiatrist, but who receive a diagnosis or have received a diagnosis that is often seen in the mental health field as kind of a chronic sort of condition, something that you'll experience throughout your life. And when that happens, I mentioned powerlessness. Because of the sense of powerlessness that it can create, and well, this is just the diagnosis I have to live with, like if it were a medical diagnosis of a chronic condition, the idea of being able to heal, the idea of being able to get to a place in your life where you no longer have those symptoms, where you no longer would meet the criteria for that diagnosis, it seems impossible. Because we kind of naturally succumb, in a sense, to the idea that, well, this is just who I am. And this has happened with personality disorders as well. Particularly borderline personality disorder is one that a lot of people that have experienced childhood trauma tend to be diagnosed with, sometimes solely because the practitioner knows that they have a history of childhood trauma. In fact, one of the things that we talked about in the training that I went to when they were trying to get it into the DSM-5 was, I think it was the DSM-5. There was another version after that. It might have been the one after that. Still 5, but then something else. Was that he believed, and John Breer was his name, and I, based on my experience, I was in full agreement with it, but that borderline personality disorder could also be a C-PTSD diagnosis. So instead of borderline personality disorder, it could be a C-PTSD. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who fits in the C-PTSD category or classification has all the symptoms associated with that, but people who fit the criteria for borderline would absolutely fit criteria for C-PTSD. But that idea that it doesn't have to be, in a sense, like a life sentence. And that's what I think is missing quite often from a lot of the things that people are saying, even in conversations that I am hearing professionals talk about sometimes. The idea that it doesn't have to be a permanent thing, it's not really talked about. It's not recognized as a very real reality. I've seen it happen with people that I have worked with that have come to me with that diagnosis or a diagnosis, and with healing, they would no longer meet criteria for that because the symptoms, whether it's depression, whether it's symptoms that are connected to a borderline diagnosis, which again, I do not agree with that diagnosis just as a whole. Whether it's C-PTSD, no matter what it is. I've even had clients that have been diagnosed, quite a few, unfortunately, that have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, who through the healing process, some of them probably didn't really meet criteria to begin with, but certainly through the healing process, they no longer struggle with those symptoms, certainly not in the way that they did previously. And that is ultimately what I really want you to take from this. Whether you are self-diagnosing or you have an official diagnosis and maybe even have been put on medication, that any mental health diagnosis that includes symptoms that are symptoms that we talk about here, or symptoms that maybe you've heard other people talk about that are related to being a survivor of childhood trauma, whether it's about interpersonal struggles or feelings and emotions, or how you respond to things, your motivation, whatever it might be. As you heal, those symptoms begin to lessen and eventually, for the most part, go away, because the things that are creating those symptoms are the things that you believe about yourself. They're about the fears that you have about who you are and what is possible for your life, and fear of the world around you, which of course makes sense that you would have given your experiences. All of that is a normal response to a very abnormal, horrendous experience, and for many, the majority of people, multiple experiences. The symptoms that you have make sense given the circumstances. And that's really kind of what C-PTSD is about. It's recognizing that we don't have to classify somebody as having traditional PTSD, because most times it didn't really fit very well. For some people it might have, but generally speaking, a lot of people were being diagnosed with PTSD and they didn't really meet criteria in the way that they probably should have to be diagnosed. And even for depression and even sometimes generalized anxiety, or certainly even a panic disorder, the symptoms, the fears that you have, the beliefs that you hold on to, which again makes sense. That's not a judgment. It's not a criticism. There's nothing about you that is weak that causes that to happen. That is the reality of what it means to be a survivor. But healing is about changing those things. It's about letting those old beliefs go. It's about dismantling those beliefs so you can create space to accept the reality that you can be safe, that you do matter, that your voice matters, that while the world can be an unsafe place, even in our adult lives, that we have much more autonomy, we have much more power and capacity than we think we do. And as we experience, as we lean into those things through the healing process, those things are no longer the struggles that we tend to have. Now, I've said this many times, healing is not about never struggling with anything again, because you will. Life happens. Life is messy. Life can be incredibly, excruciatingly hard at times. And you will struggle, because that is what it means to be human. And I've talked about the difference between when you are doing a lot of healing versus when you haven't, and all of that. But ultimately, whatever diagnosis you may have, mental health diagnosis, again, aside from schizophrenia, potentially some aspects of being on the spectrum, neurodivergent spectrum, and bipolar disorder, actual, real bipolar disorder, because I think so many people who have struggled with the symptoms of being a survivor, there's a lot of those symptoms that closely mirror what bipolar disorder can look like. And so a lot of people are misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder. But aside from those, anything else that you might be diagnosed with healing, with real, ongoing, deep healing, those symptoms get much better. Much better. I mentioned having personal experience. While I have never been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, I have no doubt that if I had gone to somebody, a therapist, and shared my history, or even separately the struggles that I had been having, the ways that I felt about myself and that sort of thing, I'm pretty confident that I likely would have been diagnosed with some aspect of a depressive disorder. Quite likely some aspect of an anxiety disorder. At that time, because of my age, probably not so much ADHD, but also there's a lot of symptoms around borderline personality disorder that people talk about mostly, and those tend to be kind of external sorts of things. I didn't necessarily have the outward sort of response, but the intense shift, the intense ability to manipulate my thoughts in certain ways was pretty good. And so there's a good chance that I might have even been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at some point in my life, if I were really honest about how quickly my thoughts about things could shift. And most of it was turned inward, so it was almost always about me and what I believed people thought about me and how it made me want to run away and the shame that would come up so quickly. Like, I very easily could have been diagnosed with any of those things. And to a degree, maybe not the borderline personality disorder, because I don't agree with that as a diagnosis, but generally, but certainly I think that there was a time that I probably was depressed, that I probably would have met some criteria for anxiety disorder, because my mind was constantly racing. I was always worried about absolutely everything. I could find the worst possible case scenario out of every circumstance, and still kind of can for the most part. It just doesn't have the same effect on me. But certainly depressed, without a doubt. But because of healing, not only would I potentially certainly no longer meet criteria for that, but I no longer had the same types of symptoms. I no longer certainly have the intensity of those symptoms after healing. So, to wrap up, whatever diagnosis, if you are somebody who has experienced childhood trauma or a lot of chaos or dysfunction, maybe you don't identify it as trauma, and maybe it isn't, but growing up in an environment in which things are uncertain, where there's a lot of stress in the home, where there's uncertainty, where there's maybe some difficult energy happening in the home or in the community, in the extended family. Certainly growing up in a circumstance in which there's a close family member who is very chronically ill, or an addict of some sort. If you're a caretaker, like, there's so many different ways that we are significantly affected as children that lead to long-lasting, pretty significant struggles that we can have. But healing is possible from all of that. It's not easy. It's not simple. It is, in fact, complex. Not just the experience, but the healing. There are so many layers to it. But know that a diagnosis, or not getting the diagnosis, maybe you went to somebody and you thought you would get the diagnosis and they said no. Well, part of that might be because it's not technically a diagnosis at this point. There's no code to put down. But not getting the diagnosis can make you feel even crazier. But whether you have or you haven't gotten a diagnosis, know that that struggle is not a life sentence. Whatever that trauma was or continued to be. And of course, that adds layers to the complexity of healing and the impact. But it does not mean that you cannot heal. It does not mean that that diagnosis has to be the symptoms that you struggle with for the rest of your life. I hope, if you have been struggling with fear or powerlessness around that today's video felt helpful to you. And know, no matter what your struggles are, you're not alone. You're really not alone. As much as you might think that you're the only one thinking a certain way, experiencing something, struggling in a certain way, I promise you, and if you know me at all, you know that I very rarely promise anything, but I can promise that you are not alone in that. I'd love to know your thoughts. What came up for you? Thanks so much for being here. I look forward to seeing you next time.